If your creative push has helped you, you can help the show by becoming a patron on Patreon. For $20, $10, $5, or $1 a month, you can not only show your support of the podcast, but also do so much to help to cover all the costs. Head to yourcreativepush.com/Patreon to find out all of the goodies that you can get when you become a patron at each of the levels, and thank you in advance for helping this show. Your Creative Push, episode 229.
It doesn't have to be perfect, but you just have to do what you believe might help.
Welcome to Your Creative Push, the podcast that pushes you to pursue your creative passions. I'm your host, Youngmin Brown, and my guest today is Sarah Goldhagen. Sarah taught for 10 years at Harvard's Graduate School of Design and spent many years as the Architecture Critic for the New Republic. She's written about buildings, cities, and landscapes for publications all over the world. Sarah's new book, Welcome to Your World: How the Built Environment Shapes Our Lives, is a thoroughly entertaining, eye-opening manifesto arguing that the buildings we live and work in deeply affect us physically and psychologically, and that we can't afford the soul-crushing architecture we mostly subject ourselves to. Sarah, welcome to the show.
Thanks. I'm happy to be here.
Well, thank you very much for being here. And before we get into the book, because I'm really excited to get into that, I was wondering if you could give us kind of a brief intro, a brief bio of how you got to the point you are today.
Well, it was kind of a circuitous path in that I initially got a PhD in architectural and art history, which, of course, is all about how things are, the meanings that you can understand from art or architecture that are historically constructed and how they're historically constructed. So you're doing a lot of that. And this book is very different because this book is really about human cognition and how people, in a more universal sense, experience space and architecture and what they need from it, and also how profoundly the built environment in which all of us live most of our lives, how profoundly it affects much more than we recognize. It affects our emotions. It affects the decisions we make. It affects how well we learn or don't learn. It affects our sense of well-being. It even affects our physical well-being and whether we heal better or worse, and so on. So some people would see this as kind of a 180 from the kind of work I did before, which was scholarship in history, in architectural history.
And yeah, before we get into that too, what are some of the ways, because I'm definitely one of those people that need to read this book, one of those people that kind of, I don't want to say walks around the world blindly, but doesn't really realize that the impact that everything around us has on us, especially the kind of structures that we live in. So what are some of the kind of pitfalls that people fall into, or some of the things that people don't realize and the ways that it affects them in a negative way?
Well, I'll break that down into two separate parts.
Okay.
The first part is there's a metaphor that I really like to use a lot when describing how people are affected by the built environment. And that metaphor is a neurological condition called blindsight. And people who are blindsighted have lesions to portions of their visual cortex. So they experience themselves as completely blind. They don't think they're seeing anything, but research has been done that shows they actually are seeing. Not perfectly, but if you ask a blindsided person to locate the light source in a room, they'll point to the right place. And the most profound example of this, which gets to more to the built environment, is there was one woman who had an unusual version of blindsight in which she was blindsided, but only in one hemisphere of her vision. The other hemisphere was normal. They did this study in which they showed her two pictures of houses completely identical, one to her blindsided side and the other to her sighted side. And the only thing that differed in the two pictures was that the one that only her blindsided side could see, the house was burning. And then they asked her which house she preferred to live in. And she always pointed to the intact house. And that, I think, is a really good metaphor for how most people experience the built environment, because most of what and how we think is not conscious. It's what I call non-conscious, which means that a lot of it you could become conscious of, but humans are wired to habituate to things. Buildings are static. They don't move. They're not people, which is what people are really interested in. And so most of us sort of don't pay much attention to the built environment. And partly as a result of that, you don't realize how much it's affecting you. But it is. I mean, there are studies after studies. One of the most famous early studies was done in the 1970s, in which an environmental psychologist studied gallbladder surgery patients in one ward of a hospital. And on one side of a corridor, the rooms looked out on a brick wall. And on the other side of the corridor, the rooms looked out on a pastoral view. And he followed these patients through recovery and found, and this has been confirmed again and again, that the people whose windows looked out on a pastoral view recovered 30% faster and got out of the hospital a full day earlier than the people whose windows were looking on a brick wall.
Oh, wow. So the brick wall, in theory, it was actually being a wall towards their recovery?
Nice way to put it. Yes,
yeah.
Absolutely. And there are hundreds of examples like that. I mean, school examples about how children learn. There's one meta-study which blew my mind, in which they took like 15 different school buildings and rated the classrooms on a bunch of different dimensions, all of which were design-oriented dimensions, like natural light and surfaces and color and this and that, places for privacy and so on. And then they followed children throughout the course of the year, and it ended up that the children who learned in the best designed classroom by the end of the year were almost a full academic year ahead of the children who learned in the worst designed classroom.
Wow.
Yeah. That's
pretty incredible. And yeah, it just goes to your point that people don't really realize the impact that it has on us. And do you think that this is like I don't know how to put this, but like to be able to make people so aware of it? I mean, I'm sure your book is definitely going to help with that, but is this kind of too big of a problem to be able to solve?
Well, I wouldn't have spent 7 years writing this book.
Yeah, 7 years.
If I thought that was true. It is a complicated problem to solve. That's for sure. I mean, the construction industry is one of the largest industries. Just take the United States. And the book actually covers not only the United States, but you have contractors, you have engineers, you have building codes, you have zoning codes, you have municipal oversight, you have real estate developers, you have architects, and so on. So some things need to change in each of those professions. But the overarching message is that people should recognize that the built environment and its quality and its design has a far, far greater impact on people than anybody previously realized. And there's tons of research in my book that proves this. And once people recognize that, then the value that's accorded to the built environment will shift societally. An analogy I often give is to, when I was growing up in my teens in the 70s, nature was nature. And, it was something we liked. And then people began to really appreciate the effects of air pollution and water pollution and pesticides and so on and so forth. And nature started to be talked about in a different way. It started to be talked about as an environment, as an integrated thing full of forests and trees and rivers, all connected to one another. And the other thing is that by shifting from nature to the environment, it became a socio-political construct, right? And now we have the Environmental Protection Agency and so on and so forth. And that's what needs to happen with the built environment, because the built environment is really where most of us live an overwhelmingly large percentage of our lives. And what the book shows is that there is no such thing as a neutral streetscape, building, landscape. If it's not doing something good for you, chances are it's doing something really not good for you.
Mm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And going along with that example, it's a perfect title for your book then. It's like, Welcome to Your World. It's like showing people like, all right, like you need to be aware of the fact that where you're choosing to spend your physical time could actually be harmful for you.
Right.
Not just mentally, but physically as well. So let's start then the healing process. Let's start helping the people listening now, especially like creative people. What's something that they can do to kind of change their environment, or something that they should be looking out for, like their creative space, where they go to create isn't actually conducive to like a creative life.
That's funny. When you asked that, the first thing I thought of was when I was writing my dissertation, which was 20 years ago. I lived in New York City because I was getting my PhD at Columbia. And my office was literally in a closet. No window.
And you're saying that's not good?
That's not good. And I, like many people who were finishing their dissertations, had some trouble finishing my dissertation. And so I actually picked up and moved back to this house that my parents co-owned with other people in Vermont and finished it there. Look, people do feel comfortable in different sorts of spaces depending upon their backgrounds and so on. But, creativity is such a demanding cognitive state that you don't want anything in the built environment that's going to be tugging at you in any way. So people need natural light and more complex natural light. Views of nature are good. Tactile experiences that because when we look at surfaces, not only do our visual neurons fire, but also our neurons associated with our sense of touch fire. So, and what that really means is that when we look at various surfaces, we actually imagine touching them, even if we're not aware of this. And so, you want surfaces that put you into a frame of mind where you can create whatever those are. I mean, one of my favorite quotes is from Richard Neutra. I happen to like kind of soft, warm, fuzzy surfaces and wood and so on, even though I really like contemporary architecture a lot. But Richard Neutra, who's a famous modern architect, died, I think, in the 1970s and did a lot of steel and glass houses. And he wrote an autobiography in which he talked about how one of his earliest memories was licking a mirror. And he loved the kind of soft, smooth, cool surface of that mirror. He liked it so much he wanted to experience it with his tongue. So it'll be different for different people, but if you wrench yourself out of the blindsided mode and start becoming aware of the environments that are good and not good for you, you'll do a better job in putting yourself in the right place when you want to make something creative.
Right. And as you're answering that, I was thinking back to, times where I've written stuff and then gone back and read it, and I remember where I was when I wrote it. And I think that's the same for a lot of visual artists as well. It's like almost like it etches this kind of memory in your head that's associated with the actual piece of art. And going along with your book too, I think one of my favorite examples was I believe it was the Scottish Parliament.
Yes.
How they have like reading nooks for all of, yeah, it's just like that kind of a space. I just wanted to be there, like looking at the images. So I think it's really important, like you said, for people to find that kind of sacred space, not sacred, but the space where they can feel the most comfortable.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I agree.
Now, getting into the book itself, we already talked 7 years to complete. Surely there must have been some kinds of trials and tribulations throughout that creative process. So I was wondering if you could walk us through that, maybe starting out by when you kind of got the idea, the inception for the book.
Well, there are a lot of answers to that, but the most immediate one I'll say is quite a personal answer, which is that, so I was the architecture critic for the New Republic and writing regularly for them. And I had surgery and I was recovering from surgery, and it was a more arduous recovery rather than a less arduous recovery. Let's put it that way. And so I was lying flat on my back a lot in my bedroom. And I would look up at the ceiling. And since I'm an architectural historian, I would remember a certain building by an architect whose work I love, who's sort of revered among architects, Alvar Aalto. He's Finnish, but he has a couple of buildings in the States. Aalto did a tuberculosis sanatorium when those things were still being built in the 1920s. And he thought about the users and he thought, well, what do they need? Well, most of these people are in bed most of the time. And so what I really need to think about is the ceiling. And so he painted different hues and tones and degrees of saturation and reflectivity patterns on the surface, so that, and because these rooms got a lot of natural light, the ceilings would change all day long. So I was lying there in bed and I was thinking, Aalto, that was so smart. He was really thinking about how people would actually experience the space that he was designing. And that's something I've always been really, really interested in. And then one day I was checking my email and an agent from New York wrote me and said, have you ever thought about writing a book for the general public? Because he'd read my TNR criticism and liked my book on Kahn. And I thought, that's it. I really want to try to figure out what I can about how people actually experience the built environment. And I knew, because I had been always interested in this anyway, I'd been reading a lot of stuff on consciousness and sort of the findings that were coming out of cognitive neuroscience with things like the discovery of mirror neurons and so on. And the more I looked into it, the more I realized that our understanding of human cognition has radically shifted in the last 25 to 30 years, really 25 years, and particularly so since the widespread use among researchers of new technologies like functional magnetic resonance imaging, and that's fMRI, or transcranial magnetic stimulation, and so on and so forth. So what we thought we knew about memory is totally different than it was 30 years ago. What we thought we knew about the different sensory modalities, we thought that, you see something or you touch something or whatever, and the brain sort of combines all these things in your head. But that's not the way it happens at all. In fact, when you see something, you're also imagining touching it, you're imagining moving through a space. And you're imagining, you're using a number of different senses, and there are many more than 5 senses to apprehend your environment. And you're also using not just your sensory system, but also your motor system. So I was reading like little studies, because this comes out of science, and scientists work on very controlled, small questions, right?
Right.
So I signed a contract with HarperCollins, and then I thought, how am I really going to do this? I don't have a scientific background. I'm a word person from the start, although I've always been really found the built environment profoundly moving and compelling in certain parts. And so in terms of the creative process of working on the book, and the reason it took me so long is because I was looking at probably 6 or 7 different disciplines within the social sciences and sciences, learning what I could about them. And most of the studies that I was consulting were really not about the built environment per se. They were about things like how people think metaphorically and non-logically. One of my favorite studies is people do think in terms of embodied metaphors, metaphors that come out of their own body. So some researchers built a 5-foot by 5-foot by 5-foot box, and they got a bunch of research subjects in there, and they had them sit inside the box, and they gave them a test. And then they brought them back 2 weeks later, and they had them sit outside the box, and they gave them another version of the same test. What the subjects didn't know is what they were testing for is creativity. And lo and behold, the people who were sitting outside the box scored consistently much higher on creativity than the people when they were sitting inside the box.
Think outside the box.
That's right. That's right. So, but the reason it took me so long is because, I found out disciplines, ecological psychology is different from environmental psychology, is different from cognitive neuroscience, is different from, sociology and so on and so forth. I ended up delving into a lot of different fields, and then it was up to me to figure out what the paradigm of how people experience their environments actually is based on these studies, most of which didn't have much to do with the built environment. So it was challenging, but it was really, really exciting too to work on.
How long did you think it was going to take you?
Well, I signed a contract and promised that I'd hand in the book in a year.
Right.
I didn't really know. I actually thought, even when I signed that contract, I thought a year, that sounds a little tight. But I certainly had no expectation that it was going to take me as long as it did.
You just got to get it right.
Yeah. Some things I would draft chapters and they would sound way too technical, and it was hard to sort of weave in the readings of landscapes and buildings and so on into, introducing psychological concepts like primes and so on. So it just took a long time.
Right. But now you have this amazing book that's filled with photography, filled with so much information that people can use as a textbook, really, for this subject.
Mm-hmm. That's what it's meant to be.
Absolutely. So congratulations to you.
Thank you.
Now, I think your story is really inspiring because I think a lot of people have these kinds of things that they want to maybe, whether it's writing a book or getting into a topic that has nothing to do with their creativity, and it would require that kind of a research for them to become kind of an expert in that. So would you have any advice for them, somebody that is listening to your story thinking, wow, yeah, she's doing what I'm in a different version of what I'm thinking of doing, knowing that I have to put my nose to the grindstone and really read tons of material and seek out experts and just become an expert myself. But that is super overwhelming and I don't want to spend so much time. Do you have any advice for somebody like that?
Well, I was overwhelmed a number of times, and there were times when I thought, I can't do this. It's just too complicated. The brain is so immensely complex. And, fears hold us back. They do. And you think, oh my God, you're not sure that you've really become enough of an expert to say the things that you're trying to say. And getting the balance right. One of the biggest challenges in the book, since I come out of a scholarly background, was really making it accessible to a general audience. And because I've spent my life, or a good deal of my life, in the academy, sometimes I would think something was accessible, and then I would give it to my editor, and she'd say, not yet, The other thing I wanted to say, and this may seem a tangent, but it's actually quite relevant, that I did teach in the academy for a number of years. I taught at Harvard for 10. And I don't think that I could have written this book if I had stayed in the academy, because the questions that it asks and the approach that it takes is just so far outside what most people in the academy who do what I do are thinking about. And in fact, before I stopped teaching, I gave a presentation of an early portion of one of the chapters of this book, and I was totally slammed because it butts up against a lot of people's beliefs about cultural construction of social realities and cultural relativism and things like that. And I'm saying, look, cultural relativism is all fine and good, but we're humans. And so let's think about the things that humans share, like the fact that they live in a body, and that their brains work in certain ways, and so on and so forth. And so I just needed solitude. I needed not to talk to people about this, not to put my ideas out there. When you're an academic, you're always, being pushed to publish more and more and more and more. And that I don't think that would have been a very conducive environment for me to write this book. And I have to say that now that I've written it, it is immensely gratifying. It was so much work. I mean, most people work hard, and I also work hard. But it was hard. It was hard thinking. It was scary at times. But I'm immensely proud of the product that I have created. And, people are paying attention. And so it is worth doing it.
Absolutely, yeah. And sometimes you just gotta not listen to anybody else and kind of go to your 5 by 5 by 5 foot box,
yeah.
and just like kind of shut up the rest of the world and just do exactly what you have in your mind.
Right.
Especially when other people don't understand it, because that means it's probably going to be something groundbreaking, to use for lack of a better term, but like, something that other people won't understand. And that's what the world needs. The world needs those kinds of new voices that are, ignoring everybody else and just saying exactly what you have in your mind.
Mm-hmm.
So congratulations to you for doing it, despite that flack that you got from people. And, if your goal was to be accessible to the general public, and if I am the litmus test for that, because I am a dummy, so you have succeeded. You get an A+ for making it accessible.
Thank
because it was completely enthralling and definitely changed my look on the world. So congratulations to you. You succeeded in that.
That's great. Thank you so much.
Oh, absolutely. The other thing that makes it accessible for a dummy like me is the fact that you used a lot of pictures. So could you talk about that too? Because that required you to travel a lot and also, I guess, work on your photography as well. Because I've heard you talk about this before too, how photography doesn't do justice to the actual experience of being in these structures or seeing them.
Right.
So can you talk about that a little bit?
Yes, I had to travel a lot. I mean, one of the first things I did, because the rapid urbanization and the rapid population growth that is effectuating so much new building, I mean, really a staggering amount of new building in so many places around the world. It's not just an American phenomenon. I mean, the most famous place people know about it is China. And I had been in India and Bangladesh, but I had never been in East Asia. So I hadn't seen these like staggeringly large megalopolises like Tokyo or Seoul or Beijing or Shanghai. So the first thing I did was go there, and just so that I had some kind of real palpable experience of what these cities were like, which was totally fascinating. The photography thing is an interesting story. I mean, photographs, I argue a lot that people think they're looking at buildings when they're just looking at pictures of buildings. I mean, I have a number of architect friends that when I say, oh, have you seen X project? A number of my friends will say, well, yeah. And what they mean is that they've seen it online. And that's not how people experience buildings. They experience, their feet on the ground, smell, acoustics, it all matters. So the photography, the book has over 175 photographs. And so you might think, well, if she's so critical about photography, why is she using photographs? But,
right.
But it's precisely for the reason that you said, which is that words can do a lot to help you understand the building that you're looking at or the streetscape or whatever, park. But pictures give you something to hang the words on. So they become really like mnemonic devices more than anything. And they will help you to really understand the argument in more depth if they're taken properly. I mean, I had a bunch of rules for the photographs that were published in the book. No aerial photographs, which I think, no architecture renderings, no photographs that were taken from places where a person couldn't actually stand and see a building. So when it came time to hand in the manuscript, the book was as long as it was. I didn't even bother to go back and look at my contract to find out how many images I was supposed to have in the book. I decided I'm just going to put a picture in every single place where I think a picture needs to be. And we'll figure it out later. And so I handed it in, and my editor read it, and she came back to me and she said, I think we need all of them.
Well, good.
And yeah, so it was great. And I do think it helps the reader a lot to kind of just concretize some of the things that they're learning as they go through it.
It absolutely does. Yeah, and that's also an important point that, sometimes we feel like we're either constrained by whether we do have an editor or not, or a self-editor that's thinking, oh, this is too much. This is more than other people put in, too many pictures. But to go with like your own sense of what's needed and what's not, like really trusting your instincts as to, what's important, what's not.
Mm-hmm.
Sarah, it's time for the final push. And this is where I ask you to reach to the microphone and grab the shoulder of one of the listeners that you've already really inspired today and just give them your best final words of advice and really push them to pursue their own creative passions or their own kind of large project that they're kind of scared of.
Well, there's so many things to say, but I think what I would say most is that one of the things that happened personally for me as I worked on this project was that I realized the only way that I was really going to be able to pull this off was if I changed the reasons why I work. So I have been in the 50s, for a lot of my life, I've been what people call other directed, sort of looking for outside approval of people and looking for affirmation that what I was saying was smart and good and illuminating and so on and so forth. And that's a really bad way to proceed because, one, people become insatiable. They always want more. And if they're not getting that kind of accolades or approval or so on, then you feel unsettled. And it makes you very nervous because you don't actually know whether people are going to like what you're doing or what you aren't. And so I actually shifted. I need to find the real reasons I work. And the real reasons I work are that I care about the social world. I believe deeply in the redemptive power of art, and architecture is an art. And I'm a good teacher. That's what I should do. I should teach. And it could be better. It could be worse. It's kind of like the concept of a good enough mother, It doesn't have to be perfect. But you just have to do what you believe might help or might bring people to new ideas and new places. And so this is something the Buddhists call this striving. And so I meditate every day and I'm interested in Buddhism. I taught myself how to strive less and teach more.
I love it. And I think that that's something that a lot of people get kind of stuck in, myself as well, is trying to be a people pleaser. And especially that's a really dangerous thing for creative people. It's just impossible to please everybody. So it's just like trying to please the people that are kind of on the same wavelength as you, or the people that didn't realize that they were on the same wavelength as you, knowing exactly what you're good at and exactly what you want to put into the world, and trying to just do that. And like you said before, ignoring everybody else.
Right. I mean, it's not even a question of pleasing others. It's just a question of doing what you do and what you think is important as best you can. And then how others receive it, you have no control over.
Absolutely. Sarah, thank you so much for coming on the show today and for giving us that push.
It was my pleasure.
And you can find Sarah on our website, which is sarahwilliamsgoldhagen.com. That's GOLDHAGEN.com. On Twitter, she is Sarah W. Goldhagen. And we will have links to her book and to everything else we talked about today at yourcreativepush.com/Sarah Goldhagen. Sarah, thanks again.
Thanks. That was really fun.
Oh man, such an interesting and eye-opening conversation with Sarah. And I love that idea that she brought up about blindsight and how you don't just take in the world from what you see with your eyes. It's really an interesting thing that we've kind of flirted with on the podcast before, but I definitely couldn't put a name to it. Your unconscious mind takes in all this information. And for creative people, that's why you need to trust your gut, because you see things in ways that other people can't. And the more that you practice seeing the world as a creative person, the better you'll be able to take in the world in your own unique way, the more confident you'll be portraying it in only the way that you can, to see things for what they are to you rather than what they are to the rest of the world. And again, the idea of going into nature, the gallbladder patient she was mentioning, recovering faster for being able to have a view of nature rather than looking at a brick wall. And my point is, and I know that Sarah would definitely agree with me here, is to put time and thought into where you are while you're creating and while you're doing your thing. And I know that's tough because space is sometimes limited. You have a full house and the only place that you're able to create is the dark basement or a tiny closet. And I also know that your time is limited. And the idea of taking 10 minutes, 15 minutes to physically relocate somewhere seems like you're just wasting time. But the time that you are able to create will be that much more worthwhile. Get out of the house. Like Sarah said, get away from those things that are tugging at you while you are creating, because it is such a demanding cognitive process. Go to your local library. I remember in college, my go-to place was the library. I would spend the 5-10 minutes to walk to the library just so that I could get out of my dorm room, so that I could have this. We had a wonderful view of the fields and the trees, and I would have this cubicle that I would sit in, and that would just be my place that I did work. And I would be much more focused and able to concentrate on the task at hand. Or if your library doesn't have a good view, maybe go to a coffee shop or a park. It doesn't matter. Somewhere where you feel good and where you feel like you have escaped your kind of daily hustle and bustle that, like we said, keeps trying to keep you from your creative passion. Physically getting out of that space will put you in a much more focused mindset and give you that reprieve from all the thoughts that you have while you're in the middle of your daily grind. And this might seem basic, but if it's so basic, then why don't you do it? If you're going to spend the time to get to your creative passion, which you should, you might as well make it the most worthwhile time possible. And the other point I wanted to make about this episode was the fact that Sarah was slammed when she first presented one of her first chapters to her colleagues. And just her pushing past her fears to go forward with writing the book and all of the work and research involved, it really should be applauded. And if you want to create something new, you're probably going to get a pushback from people who can't envision what you're talking about, because you're the one with the vision. You have to show them what you mean, and you can't let their negativity bring you down, especially when it's still in the idea phase of your idea. You have to ignore them, and that's maybe when it's better to go in that 5x5x5 box, so you can just shut them all out. Just ignore everybody and start creating it, and then show them, and then worry about it. On Monday's show, we have Lori Richmond. Lori is a corporate creative director turned picture book maker. She is the author and illustrator of several picture books, and she's also a runner. And she does this awesome thing where on her run, she picks something that she wants to draw, and then she draws it in the same amount of time as each run. So it was a really interesting way that she combines two of her passions, and I had a really fun conversation with her. It's a definitely can't miss episode for you all. You can find Lori on her website, which is loridraws.com, Lori draws.com, or you can find her on Instagram as Lori Richmond Draws, or you can find links to her stuff as well as everything we talked about today. Quite a few links for you from today's episode with Sarah at yourcreativepush.com/229. But that is all I've got for you today. Hopefully you were inspired to go and get your work done, so go and get it done and find a good place to get it done. Somewhere that makes you feel good, somewhere that allows you to escape those things that tug at you, that try to pull you away from your creative passion. And you know what? I want to hear about where that place is for you. So head to the Facebook group to share where that place is for you. Maybe take a picture of it. That place that you consider a sanctuary where you can escape your daily life to get to your creative passion. You can head to the Facebook group at yourcreativepush.com/group if you have not joined yet to join that conversation. But that's all I've got for you. I love you all. Have a wonderful, productive weekend, and we will see you next time. Bye. Never miss a push. Head to yourcreativepush.com/subscribe to find the easiest way for you to subscribe to the podcast.